Episode 1. John von Neumann's Perspective. 1. A Prelude to Conversation. I remember the evening vividly, as though the flicker of the gaslit chandeliers and the swirl of swirling suits never quite left my memory. One of my famed gatherings was in full swing, with the typical riot of chatter and laughter echoing off the glossy marble floors of my Princeton estate. I am John von Neumann, often called Johnny, though in my youth in Budapest it was simply Yanchy. But in New Jersey, among the throng of mathematicians, luminaries, and statesmen from the Institute for Advanced Study, I was Johnny in a more jocular sense, everyone's friend, ever the host. My home, perched on a quiet street near the university, was large enough to hold a veritable conference in the parlor alone. On this particular night, I had invited some truly distinguished men. I was well aware that among my guests was Alan Turing, a young Englishman with the shy but quick-witted manner of a fox, and Alonzo Church, stoic in bearing yet possessing a certain relentless spark in his eyes. Godel, the quiet Austrian genius, had also accepted my invitation. Ever since Godel arrived in Princeton, I had been enthralled by his capacity to stare into the depths of mathematical logic and glimpse truths no one else had dreamt possible. My colleagues from the Institute half joked that if you left Godel alone in a dark room for 5 minutes, he might open a door to another dimension. It was hyperbole, but not by much. David Hilbert's name, as it often did in the 1930s, hovered in the background. He was not in attendance, he remained in Göttingen, but his dream for a formal, complete, consistent system of all mathematics was always an invisible presence. In the parlor, I could hear the airy tones of the string quartet I had hired for the evening, mingling with the polite small talk of logicians, mathematicians, and a smattering of lesser-known scientists looking slightly lost in the throng. I knew that Turing, Church, and Godel, once they found each other, would inevitably circle around the same topic: how their separate lines of logic and computability converged to challenge Hilbert's once commanding vision. Despite the lavish social swirl around me, my mind was racing. I was preoccupied with new questions about computing machinery, abstract automata, and the mathematics of life itself. Ever since my work on quantum mechanics in the 1920s and early 1930s, I had been turning more of my attention to logic, the foundations of mathematics, and what might be possible if we harnessed these new mechanical methods Turing and Church wrote about. In my boisterous Hungarian way, I wanted to celebrate the leaps of logic that had taken place over the preceding decade. But the subject was both exultant and a bit funereal too. Something about Hilbert's dream was dying, or had already died, and I suspected we all wanted to eulogize it properly, with a toast of brandy or perhaps a comedic aside. I cast my gaze across the shimmering crowd of dinner guests, stepping carefully around clusters of animated conversation. Indeed, there was Turing in the corner by the grand piano, leaning forward in earnest talk with Alonzo Church. The young English mathematician's posture betrayed his typical mixture of shyness and unstoppable curiosity. Church had an older, more professorial air, as befitted a man with a grey-streaked moustache who had refined, even minted, the concept of lambda calculus. Soon I caught sight of Godel, who, though not tall, commanded attention by his quiet magnetism. He was near the window, holding a tumbler of some fruit punch I had set out. He looked pensive, absorbing the hum of voices without speaking. Feeling a surge of both mischief and a sense of history in the making, I decided the time had come for a more intimate conversation among the four of us. My parties often had side rooms, reading nooks, or cozy studies where small groups might convene for serious or half-serious discussions. Such conversations, I have always felt, are the real currency of intellectual progress, the spontaneous collision of ideas unplanned by conference schedules. With a gentle wave and an exaggerated flourish, I beckoned Turing, Church, and Godel to follow me into my study, a quiet space adorned with leather armchairs, ornate shelves of mathematics tomes, and a large blackboard. The thick door would shield us from the clamor of the festivities beyond, and so we were all there, the four of us: von Neumann, Church, Turing, Godel. We shut the door, leaving behind the swirl of violin music and chattering guests. The hush descended like a stage curtain at an opera. I had arranged for the help to place a small bar cart in the corner, complete with a collection of liqueurs and brandies. I poured myself a glass of Tokaji, the sweet Hungarian wine that reminded me of home, and invited the others to partake. Turing declined, explaining in his gentle, clipped accent that he preferred to keep his wits about him. Church took a mild whiskey. Godel sipped the punch, which was the only beverage I'd ever seen him partake in. He was rumoured to be very careful about what he consumed. Then, in that hush, with only the faint hints of music pressing in from outside, we embarked on a conversation that would linger in my mind for many decades. 2. The spark of an idea. I was the host, so I began the conversation. "Gentlemen," I said with a smile, "the night is young and our thoughts are many. My house is yours, my brandy is yours. Most of all, I wish for this discussion to be ours, and possibly for posterity. Let's begin at the root. Hilbert's problem, the Entscheidungsproblem, and the dream of a fully mechanizable mathematics. Where do we stand?" I looked to Church, the senior among us, in terms of his calm, scholastic approach to logic, but Turing spoke up first. "David Hilbert's dream," Turing said quietly, "has long guided mathematics, for better or worse. He wanted to see if there was a systematic method, an algorithm, to determine the truth or falsity of any mathematical statement in a formal system. My Turing machine concept was partly an attempt to formalize this notion of method or effective procedure. A glint of pride shone in Turing's eye, though there was also a gentle reticence about him, as though he sometimes wondered if he'd gone too far in demolishing an old dream. "Mr. Church and I arrived at the same conclusion from different angles," Turing continued. "Namely, there exists no mechanical procedure, no universal algorithm that can solve every mathematical question. Hilbert's Entscheidungsproblem is not solvable." I heard Church utter a soft grunt of agreement. "We call it undecidability." "Yes," he said. "My lambda calculus was one formal vantage. Turing's machines, another. We ended up with the same result. If you attempt to incorporate all of mathematics into a single formal system in which truth can be automatically decided, you run headlong into a logical impasse." Godel, who had been silent, gave a small nod. "This was to be expected after I found the incompleteness phenomenon," he said in a near whisper, his Austrian accent gentle yet distinct. "Any sufficiently powerful axiomatic system that includes arithmetic can express statements that it cannot prove or disprove. If mathematics had an all-encompassing, consistent, decidable system, well, that would contradict incompleteness. Hilbert's program was thus shown to be, in the final analysis, unattainable." I sipped my Tokaji. "Yes, and let's be frank, I cannot help but feel some sense of tragedy in Hilbert's ambition," I said. "He was a man of unstoppable optimism, a giant in geometry, in the theory of integral equations, in so many fields. But in logic, though his impulse was invaluable, he misjudged the nature of mathematics itself." "At the same time," Turing broke in with a thoughtful smile, "I like to think we haven't left Hilbert's dream altogether in tatters. I see it as a stepping stone to new realms of mathematics and computation. The negative result, the demonstration that no universal method can decide all statements, is also a revelation about what can be done and about what might be beyond the power of mechanical processes." Church agreed. "Indeed. And your universal Turing machine, Alan," he said, with an amiable nod in Turing's direction. "It's a thing Hilbert could not have imagined in 1900 or so. In a sense, it's a mechanical encapsulation of all possible algorithms. That concept points us to the birth of computer science, does it not?" I listened with delight as the conversation volleyed back and forth. My guests might not have recognized it at the time, but the synergy among them was magical. The synergy is what I had hoped to foster by bringing them together in a quiet room. Godel, leaning forward slightly in his chair, commented, "There is more, though. The fact that certain truths cannot be proven by any formal system does not necessarily imply they are not true. If we hold a Platonist viewpoint, we might say that mathematics has an objective existence, a realm of truths that surpass our ability to capture them with finite axioms. I recognized the twinkle in Gödel's eyes, the philosophical edge he often carried. "Ah, yes," I said. "Now we wander into territory about which we might also mention Ludwig Wittgenstein, or perhaps Georg Cantor. Infinity, logic, set theory, the human mind. We might be here all night, you realize." Turing gave a small laugh. "I'd prefer the night not end," he said. Church shrugged with a quiet contentment. "I'm in no hurry." Then I took another sip of Tokaji and motioned for them to get comfortable. "Settle in, then," I said. "I have an abundance of brandy and an abundance of curiosity, so let us carry on." 3. Reflections on an Era. Though the party roared on in the background, in that study we were in a world of our own. At intervals I leaned back and considered how I had come to Princeton and to the Institute for Advanced Study, how we all had arrived there. We were a diaspora from Europe in some sense. I was Hungarian, Godel was Austrian, Turing was English, and even Church, the American, was part of a tradition that owed so much to the earlier European impetus in mathematics. It was the 1930s, and Europe was in turmoil. Hitler had come to power in Germany, and we could all sense the precariousness of the times. But in our domain, we were forging new paths in mathematics, forging them here, in an American institution that had welcomed some of the brightest minds fleeing an increasingly dark climate. I had once studied under Hilbert in Göttingen. It was still startling to see how swiftly that golden era had ended. But the logic we had discovered, Godel's incompleteness, Turing's machine concept, Church's lambda calculus, these were not ephemeral statements. They signaled a fundamental shift in how mathematicians viewed formal systems. They also seeded the field that would become computer science. I might have been best known for my work in quantum theory, operator algebras, and eventually game theory. But the reason I adored logic was that it offered a vantage point on the structure of all mathematics, indeed on thought itself. That night, I realized we stood on the threshold of something new, something bigger than Hilbert's or anyone's dream. For me, it was the notion that logic was not merely an austere proof discipline, but a gateway to building automated systems. I suspected the mechanical approach Turing so precisely described would become an actual physical technology in short order. Eventually, I found an opening to mention my own budding ideas. "Turing," I said, "I've read your paper on computable numbers and the Entscheidungsproblem. Absolutely brilliant. I have wondered, are you thinking about constructing an actual universal Turing machine, a machine of gears and wires that might interpret instructions coded in some manner? Perhaps something that manipulates electromagnetic signals to represent symbols. I cannot help but wonder if we might see, in our lifetimes, such an invention." Turing, who had been listening politely, let out a soft chuckle. "You read my mind, or we share a mind, maybe. I am definitely exploring ways to transform the abstract universal machine into a real device, a computer. Although to build such a device is a complicated engineering challenge that requires the right resources, money, staff, time. But I do believe it is possible." Church nodded. "That's part of our new future, I suspect. Mechanical or electrical devices that compute and follow instructions. The question is, what do we use them for? I suppose Hilbert would have wanted them to solve all of mathematics at once." He smirked ironically. "But that is not possible. Still, there's a wide realm of tasks these hypothetical machines could handle." Godel's eyes lit with subdued fascination. "It is incredible to think about. Imagine an artificial mind, or at least a device that simulates aspects of reasoning. Would such a thing approach the boundary of human intelligence?" I raised my finger. "Exactly, my dear Kurt. I suspect so. Perhaps in time these machines might even surpass human ability in certain aspects. Let's not forget that mathematics is not just about logic. There is also intuition, creativity. But to systematically handle routine tasks, a machine might excel. This is a dream I have nurtured, the creation of thinking automata. I paused, letting the idea linger. Turing's eyebrows rose, an almost playful glint crossing his expression. Certainly, that might be possible. We could, in principle, encode logical reasoning as instructions, but I see no direct reason why we can't go further. There is no theoretical limit, short of the constraints of memory or time, to what a universal Turing machine can do if it is given enough data and the right instructions. The real question is whether understanding emerges from that process. We reflected on that word, understanding. Each man was silent. Perhaps we all recognize the magnitude of that question, the philosophical complexities swirling around it. Incompleteness theorem said certain truths can't be pinned down by formal systems. That might suggest that the totality of human understanding can't be reduced to a mechanical method, or maybe it suggests it can be, but only partially. The tension was palpable. Church was the one to break the silence with a measured tone. We do well to remember that the formal systems we talk about are not necessarily the full measure of the mind. Still, it's a vast expansion from the naive belief that everything is trivially formalizable. Our generation has glimpsed the boundary lines. Gödel's theorems and the undecidability results show that the pure formality has inherent limits. But that doesn't mean there isn't a wide, wide world of possibility for mechanical computation within those limits. At that moment, I felt an odd sense of synergy. Here, in the hush of my study, I realized we were speaking not only as mathematicians, but as explorers in uncharted territory. We had discovered that mechanical reasoning had fundamental boundaries, yet the notion of constructing such mechanical reasoners was no longer hypothetical. My mind flooded with images, circuits, vacuum tubes, as used in radio technology, signals representing binary digits, big, clanking machines that could compute. The conversation soared. Quarter riposte to Hilbert. I wanted to lighten the mood, so I offered a small piece of comedic relief. Poor Hilbert, I said with a grin. Perhaps we should pen a letter telling him, all is not lost. We can build giant computers that do some of what you wanted, just not everything. He might appreciate that, don't you think? Turing laughed. Though if we try to mechanize mathematics with these giant contraptions, they might fill entire rooms and devour electricity at a monstrous rate, not quite as neat and tidy as a single algorithmic solution. True, Church agreed, but I suspect Hilbert might have liked the idea that mathematicians can push some of the drudge work off onto machines, though I wonder if he'd lament how it means the final dream of completeness was shattered. He paused, a thoughtful smile crossing his face. He famously said, "We must know, we will know. I guess we can only know up to a point." Godel tapped a single finger against his glass. He also famously said, "There is no ignorabimus in mathematics." Unfortunately, that's exactly what we discovered. There are statements within these systems that are independent of the axioms or that can't be decided algorithmically. Perhaps a better motto is, there is a boundary to what we can prove, but there is no boundary to inquiry. I lifted my glass. I'll drink to that, Kurt. The four of us shared a momentary toast. Turing with a glass of water, Church with a modest swig of whiskey, Godel sipping punch, and I with my sweet Hungarian wine. We raised our glasses in quiet acknowledgement of Hilbert's remarkable legacy and the new horizon that had emerged from its partial collapse. 5. A sojourn into automata. Though we had been speaking for half an hour or so, the night was young, and I was brimming with curiosity. My mind drifted to a new project I was formulating, what we might now call cellular automata. I had begun to toy with the idea that complex structures could emerge from simple local rules. The connection to Turing's concepts of universal machines was not lost on me. I turned to Turing, who had just put his glass down. "Alan," I began, "I hope you don't mind if I leap into a new direction here. You might be aware of a notion I have been exploring, that computation can happen not only in a single device that reads tape and changes states, but also in a distributed system of cells. Like a grid, each cell in one of a finite number of states, evolving by some local rule. Essentially, each cell's behavior depends on its neighbors, and the entire grid evolves step by step. I saw Turing's eyes go bright, in that way a mathematicians do when they sense a new puzzle. Like a two-dimensional array of Turing machine heads, each with a small set of states. That's a fascinating notion, Johnny. Perhaps you could get self-replicating structures, or emergent behaviors reminiscent of biology. I nodded eagerly. Precisely. I have begun to think about the geometry of life, if you will. If we implement the right local rules, we might see patterns that replicate themselves, or perhaps ones that perform logical operations. In a sense, this is akin to building a universal machine out of many small interacting parts. It's perhaps analogous to what you, Turing, and you, Church, have done with formal logic, but now manifested in a purely local, rule-based structure. Church tapped his chin. Yes, yes. In your design, the global complexity emerges from local simplicity. This is reminiscent of how we sometimes describe universal Turing machines. A finite set of states can, in principle, simulate any computable function given enough tape. So maybe a finite set of local rules can simulate any computation if you arrange them in the right topology. Godel offered a gentle, inquisitive gaze. One wonders if such a system might also run into undecidable phenomena. Could it be that even in these distributed automata, certain behaviors are unpredictable or undecidable from an initial configuration? So in a sense, you might recapitulate the same limits we discovered in formal logic, only in a more visual or mechanical setting. I spread my hands. Exactly. That's the link. Undecidability might appear in the behavior of these cellular systems. We could pose questions like, does a given pattern eventually fill the entire grid or eventually become periodic? And we might not be able to decide the answer by a finite process. In my view, that's not a defect, but a sign of how richly these systems can parallel the complexities of mathematics itself. Turing's face split into a boyish grin. I suspect that in a few decades, or maybe even sooner, these ideas will flourish into a new discipline. People might even build machines that can store arrays of bits representing these cells, stepping through rules. We could experiment on a scale we never could by hand. I laughed, imagining the future. They'll likely need to invent better computing hardware first. Right now, we're dealing with mechanical relays and perhaps vacuum tubes. But it's a thrilling vision to see how far we can push mechanical intelligence, be it sequential or distributed. We might eventually call it artificial intelligence, yes? Church pursed his lips thoughtfully. Artificial intelligence. Interesting phrase. Indeed, the notion that machines might do tasks that appear to require human intelligence. Perhaps it will exist. But let's not get too grandiose. Then again, I recall your commentary, Turing, in which you said we might one day speak of machines thinking if they could imitate human conversation well enough. It's intriguing. But who knows? Turing shrugged modestly. I can see it happening. But for now, the serious question is about pushing the frontiers of computation to see what is possible. I'm happy to leave the philosophical dimension. Do machines truly think for the future? Meanwhile, we do well to recall that logic theorems, Gödel's, Church's, mine, tell us that certain questions have no definitive algorithmic procedure. That sets the boundary, or at least suggests it. Godel nodded, a small smile on his face. Fascinating. Even as we talk about these potential machines becoming ever more powerful, we remember that the fundamental structure of mathematics still resists total mechanization. That paradox is wonderful. Perhaps humans will remain essential to mathematics, bridging the leaps that formal systems can't quite make. Or perhaps humans will discover new ways to circumvent these limitations. I do not know. At that point, we all fell silent for a moment, letting the implications sink in. The conversation had roamed from Hilbert's shattered hopes to a gleaming vision of future automata. We had recognized that incompleteness, while it closes certain doors, opens others. In short, mathematics was alive, inexhaustible, and bigger than any single formal system or machine. And we were at the threshold of building machines that might take us deeper into that infinite ocean of questions. 6. Shadows of War and Fate. Though we seldom spoke of politics or the looming storm clouds over Europe, we were each aware that our mathematical idol lived in precarious times. To lighten the air, I recounted a small anecdote about Hilbert's wit. "I remember," I said, "Hilbert once wrote, 'One can measure the importance of a scientific work by the number of earlier publications rendered superfluous by it.' If that's true, then you three men have rendered quite a bit of earlier speculation about the Entscheidungsproblem superfluous. He ought to be proud, in a sense." That made Turing laugh, a small ripple of joy. "Your comedic timing, Johnny, is always impeccable." Church chimed in. "I recall Hilbert had once believed that the continuum hypothesis and the entire foundations of mathematics might yield to systematic axiomatics. Godel, of course, confounded the matter with his work on the consistency of the continuum hypothesis relative to ZF set theory. In some sense, that was another blow to Hilbert's dream." Godel nodded. "Yes, indeed. I showed that the continuum hypothesis cannot be disproved from the usual axioms of set theory, provided those axioms are consistent. That doesn't necessarily prove it is true, only that it can't be shown false by standard methods. Later, Paul Cohen might show other angles. Who can say?" He gave a small wry smile, as if to say, "Knowledge of the future is impossible." Yet he had a sense of the expansions to come. In any event, these are large, subtle questions that reveal again that mathematics is not a neat, locked box. It's more like an endless labyrinth with surprising corridors. We all let that statement resonate. The labyrinth of mathematics, full of corridors that formal reasoning cannot fully map. If Hilbert had built a partial blueprint, Godel, Turing, and Church revealed that some hallways stretch forever or vanish into paradoxical realms. My sense of humor kicked in again. Perhaps we should throw a labyrinth-themed ball next time. We can invite Hilbert's ghost for good measure. Church coughed out a chuckle. Turing cracked a small grin. Godel's eyes glimmered. It was always good to see him in high spirits. 7. A brief interruption. A soft knock on the study door interrupted our reverie. One of my hired butlers poked his head in, his expression politely apologetic. "Mr. von Neumann, Doctor. Einstein has arrived and is wondering if you might greet him." I had invited Albert Einstein as well. Yes, though he typically avoided large social gatherings, he had occasionally shown up at my events out of courtesy. "Certainly," I said to the butler. "Ask him to make himself comfortable, and I'll attend to him momentarily." I turned back to my assembled luminaries. "Gentlemen, would you like to join me? Einstein might find your conversation about decidability and automata quite interesting, although, fair warning, he often dismisses quantum mechanical interpretations if they offend his sense of realism." Godel shrugged. "I would join you, but perhaps I'll linger here for a few more minutes. My mind is still enthralled by what we've been discussing." He gave a wry half-smile that said, "I'm not particularly sociable tonight." Church and Turing both seemed intrigued, but also reluctant to leave the private bubble of discussion. "I might go out and greet him for a moment," Turing said, "but I should like to come back if you do not mind." "No problem, my friend," I said. "This is your house as much as mine, at least for the evening. I'll be right back." I rose from my leather armchair, nodded to the others, and stepped into the hallway. I could hear the hubbub from the parlor as the large crowd continued mingling. I was excited at the chance to speak with Einstein. He was the towering figure of physics, after all, and see if he had any new thoughts about quantum mechanics or the cosmic expansions it implied. But part of me wanted to dash right back into that study. The conversation with Turing, Church, and Godel was unlike anything else. In the parlor, though, I found myself politely greeting Dr. Einstein, who gave me his usual gentle wave. We exchanged pleasantries while a gaggle of admirers circled around him. I introduced Turing, who followed me out, but soon Turing politely excused himself to slip back into the study. He was enthralled by the deep conversation, and frankly, so was I. After a few minutes of social niceties, I decided to extricate myself as well. Einstein understood. He had come mainly to greet friends and share in the convivial atmosphere, not to be the center of attention all night. I told him he was welcome to find me if he wanted a more private word. Then I made my way back to the study. Outside the door, I paused. I could hear the murmur of the conversation continuing. Turing's voice, more animated than usual, responding to something Church had said, and then Godel's quieter tone, offering a subtle correction. My heart quickened with delight. Rarely do you have so many giants in one room, so spontaneously engaged. I smoothed down my jacket, re-entered, and poured myself another small glass of Tokaji. 8. The heart of the matter. The discussion resumed at once. Turing was reflecting on the concept of oracles. If you recall, he said to Church and Godel, I introduced the concept of an oracle machine in that 1939 paper. The idea is to imagine a Turing machine that can consult an oracle for certain problems it cannot solve on its own, like the halting problem, for instance. This is a formal way of showing there could be hierarchies of unsolvability. Church inclined his head, one eyebrow arching. Yes, yes, I recall. In effect, it's a formalization of the idea that if we had a black box that solved the halting problem, we could solve more complicated problems until we face a new halting-like problem at the next level. It's a layered approach to understanding the limits of computation. Godel added, and each layer still might have its own incompleteness or undecidability results. A tower of oracles, each more powerful than the last, might exist, but none of them would solve everything, so to speak. It's a demonstration of the inexhaustibility of mathematics, is it not? I found this notion delightful. A tower of oracles, like an infinite set of Turing machines, each tapping the next for help with the unsolvable problem at its own level. But still, no single oracle resolves everything. It's mind-boggling. Even though we mechanize logic to the hilt, we remain in a space of infinite vistas. Church mused, that's the beauty of it. Hilbert asked for one grand theorem, a method to decide all of mathematics. We respond with an infinite hierarchy of problems, each one requiring its own oracle or some other additional power. It's a wonderful irony. Turing hesitated a moment, then gave a soft grin. And from that vantage, we might say that building real mechanical computers is only the first step. We'll discover limitations, like the halting problem. We can't predict if an arbitrary program will halt. That's a purely theoretical statement, but perhaps in practice we'll approximate. Still, I believe the existence of these machines will open new avenues that Hilbert never dreamed. I nodded vigorously. Yes, Turing, I concur. I believe we will see entire new disciplines forming around these machines. They might revolutionize everything. Mathematics, physics simulations, cryptography, you name it. And even though fundamental questions remain unsolvable, the machines will do incredible tasks within those boundaries. Godel's glance drifted toward me. John, I've heard you're doing some new work on computing machinery in collaboration with others. A rumor states that you might be involved in some project for the government, though that's hush-hush, yes? I shrugged, feigning innocence. I can't speak much about that, Kurt. Let's just say that there is a recognized potential for these machines to aid in complex calculations, and certain agencies are indeed interested. The war in Europe is a grim impetus for the acceleration of technology. Turing offered a sad nod. Yes, in England, we might soon see conflict. I fear for all that might happen. But perhaps a small silver lining is that the government invests in new computing devices for code-breaking or ballistic calculations. That might, ironically, push forward the entire field. Church set his glass down, and the faint clink sounded in the hush. One hopes the eventual peace will yield a more benign use of such machines. We were silent for a moment, each man doubtlessly reflecting on the precarious times. The war drums were growing louder, and while we wanted to talk only of mathematics and logic, the real world intruded. 9. Turning to lighter matters. At length, I summoned a smile. Well, let's not lose ourselves in gloom, gentlemen. The night is ours, and we have an entire party of bright minds out there waiting, perhaps, for the next waltz. We can't stay holed up forever. Should we rejoin them? Church peered at his watch. Indeed, we must not be rude. But this conversation, my, how it invigorates me. Godel gave a small laugh. I'd quite like to remain here, but yes, let us stretch our legs at least. We might reconvene later for a second round of private discussion if time permits. Turing rose from his chair. I'll follow your lead. Though, Johnny, do you happen to have some sweets? I find myself craving a bit of sugary pastry after so much deep talk. I stifled a chuckle. Turing's sweet tooth was something of an open secret. Of course, Alan. In the dining room, you'll find an entire dessert spread. Knock yourself out. We filed out of the study, each man carrying some intangible swirl of thoughts, revelations, or renewed convictions about the future of mathematics and computation. We returned to the main party, the swirl of conversation and music enveloping us once more. Einstein was there, chatting with a small group, while others roamed about. My mind was abuzz. I resolved to carefully remember the essential points from this conversation, for I sensed that historians might look back at gatherings like this, moments when logic's greatest minds crossed paths, and wonder how it felt to be in that room, tasting the brandy of a new intellectual frontier. 10. An evening interlude. As I re-entered the social fray, a wave of acquaintances and well-wishers approached, distracting me from that luminous conversation. I saw Turing slip quietly to the dessert buffet, while Church ambled toward a gaggle of mathematicians from the university. Godel, quiet as always, navigated the edges of the room, drawn perhaps by Einstein. I pivoted gracefully among guests, offering a word of greeting here and there, exchanging jokes, ensuring the drinks were replenished. A hostess's duties never end. Yet all the while my mind was on that discussion. Hilbert's dream, undone by incompleteness and undecidability. But in place of that old dream, new wonders had grown. I could hardly contain my excitement. The notion of a universal machine, the possibility of cellular automata, the idea of oracles, all pointed to the dawn of an era that might eventually yield electronic brains, as I like to call them. The end of an old dream is often the beginning of a new one. Perhaps it was after midnight, when having seen off a bevy of guests and exchanged thanks, I noticed that Turing, Church, and Godel had again clustered together near the music room, deep in conversation. With a grin, I sidled over, hoping to catch a snippet of their further musings. They were enthralled in a topic I had missed the start of, something about the Church-Turing thesis. In essence, they were enumerating the ways in which all known models of computation were equivalent in power. I gathered that Church had recently been refining the notion that the lambda calculus can simulate Turing machines, and Turing was reciprocating with the demonstration that Turing machines can emulate the lambda calculus. Godel was weighing in with some questions about recursiveness. It was all standard among us by then, but hearing them talk about it was a treat. They were forging a new branch of mathematics right before my eyes. 11th, pauses in the flow of time. At length, the string quartet in the parlour concluded their final piece, signifying the winding down of the evening's entertainment. The crowd began to thin out around 1 a.m., which I suppose was not unusual for my parties, though I'm sure some left earlier. Turing excused himself, needing to rest. Church, too, said his goodbyes, graciously thanking me for the hospitality. Godel lingered a bit longer, but eventually said he would retire. I walked him to the door, stepping out onto the porch with him. The crisp night air enveloped us, and the hush of a Princeton street at that late hour seemed a stark contrast to the lively interior we had just left. Godel paused at the top step, gazing out into the dark. "Johnny," he said quietly, "this was marvelous. I must say, your parties are more than social. They are catalysts for ideas." I bowed my head slightly. "Thank you, Kurt. I'm very glad you could make it. Your presence always adds depth." He gave a small, enigmatic smile and walked off into the night. I watched him go, a slight figure under the yellow glow of the street lamp. Then, with a sigh of contentment and just a hint of melancholy, I returned inside. The staff was cleaning up the remnants of wine glasses and dessert plates. The hush felt almost sacred. I was exhausted, yet my mind buzzed with a restless vigor. Conversations with the likes of Turing, Church, and Godel do that to a man. 12th. Late-night reflections. I retired to my study once more, standing alone amid the soft glow of the lamps. The blackboard with half-scribbled equations beckoned to me. There, I had tried earlier in the day to articulate some notion of partial recursive functions. Now, having spoken with Turing and Church, I saw new lines of insight. I picked up a piece of chalk and wrote, "No single formal system can decide all truths in arithmetic. No single method can decide all statements in first-order logic. Computation, though unbounded in principle, always meets halting oracles." Then I drew a small diagram of a grid, my nascent idea of a cellular automaton. "What wonders," I murmured to myself, imagining a future in which machines might hum with logic, imitating life or forging new solutions. The chalk squeaked as I sketched an arrow from universal machine to distributed automata. The future might contain marvels beyond our imagination. But I also recalled the fundamental theorems. No matter how powerful the machine, there would always be truths beyond its mechanical grasp. And yet, that limitation did not dishearten me. Mathematics was alive, thriving in the knowledge of its own self-imposed boundaries. In fact, that knowledge was itself a testament to the human spirit. I set the chalk down, sank into my armchair, and closed my eyes. The swirl of the night's conversation replayed in my mind. I pictured Turing's gentle expression as he recounted the concept of the universal machine, Church's measured tone discussing lambda calculus, Gödel's quiet, otherworldly insight into incompleteness. And yes, Hilbert's old dream, now recast in the light of these new revelations, no longer the path to finality, but rather the impetus to keep exploring. The door on a fully mechanizable mathematics was closed, yet behind it were infinite corridors. A paradox, but a beautiful one. 13. Memory and legacy. The next morning, I rose early and scrawled notes in my journal. I tried to capture the gist of our conversation. Little did I know that decades later, the field of computing would explode, and the seeds planted in these discussions would grow into entire forests. But in that fresh morning light, I was content to reflect on the synergy of minds that had gathered under my roof. Perhaps future generations would glean from our conversation that logic is not a cold discipline, but a living tapestry, woven with the threads of philosophy, computation, and creativity. I also penned a letter to a colleague, trying to distill the essential philosophical point. Hilbert's program was undone by Godel, Church, and Turing, but from that undoing emerged the entire notion of computability. It was as if the grand puzzle of mathematics was meant to remain unsolved at the highest level, thus igniting an unending sequence of smaller, solvable problems that would feed the progress of generations to come. If Hilbert had succeeded in finding a single mechanical method for all truth, mathematics might have become staid, completed. Instead, mathematics is unbounded, inexhaustible. Strange though it may sound, perhaps we should be grateful. 14th final rumination. And so, as I bring my recollection of that night to a close, my perspective as John von Neumann, I do so with a sense of wonder. Logic had come of age, delivering both a negative result, no universal solver, and a positive one, the invention of computability theory. Godel, Church, Turing, each had contributed a crucial brick in the structure of modern thought. and my role was that of a willing host, an enthusiastic collaborator, a dreamer of the new mechanical possibilities. That interplay, that delicate dance of minds, was far more than a social courtesy. It was the forging of a new epoch in mathematics and, dare I say, in the human enterprise as a whole. Yes, we had closed the door on David Hilbert's dream, but we had walked through a new door into the realm of universal machines, cellular automata, and, some distant day, artificial intelligence. And in the hush of that final moment, with the blackboard still smudged and the wine glasses not yet fully cleaned, I felt the hush of destiny whisper, "This is only the beginning." In the next episode, we will hear Alonzo Church's perspective on this same evening, picking up threads of conversation and weaving them into his own logical viewpoint, personal reflections, and recollections of his interactions with Turing, von Neumann, and Gödel.